Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
It started like any ordinary Tuesday, quiet, unremarkable, and laced with just enough routine to make it feel safe, or at least predictable, which I've learned is sometimes the most dangerous illusion of all. I had just finished my second cup of coffee, still in my soft house sweatshirt, half listening to a podcast I wasn't really absorbing while flipping through a stack of mail that had been sitting by the door since the weekend. Most of it was the usual flyers, credit card offers, and bills already paid online, but one envelope caught my eye, not because of how it looked, but because of how it felt in my hand, slightly heavier, the paper thicker. The bank logo stamped clean across the corner in a way that made something tighten in my chest before I'd even opened it. I don't know why I paused. Maybe something in my gut knew that whatever was inside was going to split my life into a before and an after. But I opened it anyway, slow, careful, trying not to let my mind run ahead of me. The first thing I saw was my name, printed clearly at the top of the statement, and that alone didn't feel strange at first. I've had accounts at that bank for years. What felt strange was the word loan printed in bold, followed by an account number I didn't recognize and a balance that made my stomach twist hard and fast. At first, I honestly thought it was a mistake, some clerical error or mix-up. I scanned the statement 3 times, flipping pages, looking for some tiny detail that would explain how my name was listed as a primary borrower on a business startup loan I had never even heard of, let alone signed for. I sat there frozen, one hand still gripping the edge of the letter while the other instinctively reached for my laptop, pulling up my online banking just to reassure myself that this was a glitch. But there it was again, buried in the documents, my name, my information, my responsibility. And then came the sinking realization that someone, somewhere, had put that debt in my name deliberately. The panic hit me in waves, sharp, disorienting, rising in my throat like nausea. I called the bank immediately, hands shaking as I pressed through the automated prompts, tapping my foot against the floor like that small, rhythmic motion could somehow keep me tethered to something real. When I finally reached a real person, I could barely get the words out. I explained what I'd received, told them it had to be a mistake, that there was no way I had taken out a loan, that I needed someone to verify what the hell was going on. The woman on the phone was kind, but clinical, her voice practiced and calm in a way that made me feel even more out of control. She asked me to verify my identity, then put me on hold for what felt like an hour. When she came back on the line, her tone had shifted just slightly, still polite, but with the edge of someone about to deliver news that she knows will not go over well. "Yes," she said, "the loan is active. It was initiated 6 months ago and signed with a digital authorization under your account. All documentation points to your personal ID and email being used as verification." I was already shaking my head, even though she couldn't see me. "But I didn't sign anything," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "I didn't apply for any loan." There was a pause, just a fraction too long, and then she added, "According to the account records, the loan was initiated by James Carter, my father." I think I stopped breathing for a full minute. The words didn't make sense, didn't fit into any version of reality I was prepared to confront. I asked her to repeat it. She did. I scribbled it down, even though my hand barely worked, and asked her to send the full documentation by email. I thanked her, somehow hung up the phone, and just sat there, staring at the screen, heart pounding in my ears, 1,000 thoughts crashing into each other all at once. There had to be an explanation, right? Maybe he used my information by mistake. Maybe there was some miscommunication. Maybe I was missing a detail. Maybe I was just being dramatic. But deep down, I already knew. I knew what I'd see when I opened those emailed documents. I knew what had happened, even if I hadn't wanted to believe it. And it wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't just disappointment. It was the bitter confirmation of something I'd suspected for years, but never had proof of, that in my family, love was conditional, and trust was negotiable as long as it served someone else's need. I dialed his number, fingers trembling, each ring feeling louder than the last. He picked up on the third. "Hey, Ratch," he said, like nothing had happened, like we were just catching up. I didn't waste time. You took out a loan in my name? He didn't even pause. Didn't sound surprised. Just sighed like I was being overly dramatic about something trivial. It's just family, he said, like that was supposed to make it okay. You owe us. I sat on the couch long after the call ended, phone still clutched in my hand like it might somehow explain itself if I held onto it long enough. The words kept playing over and over in my head like an echo I couldn't outrun. It's just family. You owe us. He'd said it so casually, so matter-of-fact, like it was a universally accepted truth rather than a slap across the face, like it was some moral obligation written into the fine print of being born into the Carter household. And maybe, in their eyes, it was. Maybe that's how they had always seen me, not as a daughter, not as an individual, but as an investment. A resource. A fallback plan that never complained. I tried to shake it off, but the deeper I let the realization settle, the further the memories started to unravel behind it, one after another like a string pulled loose from a too-tight sweater. It wasn't just this loan. It wasn't just this betrayal. It was every quiet sacrifice that came before it, every unspoken expectation that had been placed on my shoulders while Brandon, the golden boy, the dreamer, the serial underachiever with a shiny smile, was handed chance after chance, failure after failure, without ever being asked to pay for any of it. I thought about the summer I postponed my trip to Europe because Mom and Dad's car needed emergency repairs and Brandon's credit was already shot from the last business loan he defaulted on. I thought about the time I took a second freelance gig just to help them cover the back taxes they conveniently forgot to mention until the final notice came in the mail. I remembered the year I didn't go home for Christmas, not because I didn't want to, but because they needed help with their mortgage, again, and I drained my savings covering their shortfall. And still, through it all, I'd convinced myself it was just part of being the dependable one, the responsible daughter, the one who had her shit together while everyone else got to stumble and be forgiven. It was a role they never asked me to play outright, but one they quietly applauded every time I absorbed another hit without flinching. And now, looking back, I realized that maybe the reason I had always been labeled independent wasn't because they admired it, it was because it was convenient for them not to care about what it cost me. Brandon had always been the dreamer. The one with business ideas scribbled on napkins and investor pitches that sounded good over drinks, but never made it past the planning phase. He'd failed twice by 25, once with a landscaping company he barely managed to register, and once with a sports bar that never made it past the permits. And both times, Mom and Dad had cleaned up after him like it was just another rite of passage, another misunderstood genius whose only flaw was being ahead of his time. Me? I was working 2 jobs through college, didn't ask for a dime, and still got told I was too intense. I never made messes they had to fix, but somehow I was still the one who always owed them something. Because in their minds, my competence was permission. My silence was agreement. My success was theirs to leverage. Have you ever been expected to carry a weight you never asked for, just because you were the responsible one? Ever had love used like a leash tightened when you pull away, loosened only when you stay obediently close? Tell me in the comments. I need to know I'm not the only one who sat at a dinner table, smiling through clenched teeth while your parents praise your siblings' latest half-baked idea and call you too serious for asking how it's going to be paid for. When I finally drove over to their house that weekend, I already knew how the conversation would go. I already knew the way my father would cross his arms and shift into that tone he always used when he thought authority was a substitute for decency. I already knew my mother would play mediator, her voice syrupy and careful, trying to guilt me into submission without ever raising hers. And I was right. I didn't even get through the full sentence before James interrupted me. He needed it, he said, shrugging like it was the most obvious thing in the world. You'll be fine. You always are. Donna chimed in with her trademark soft concern, hands wringing in her lap like she was the one being wronged. You know your brother's not as stable as you. You've always been stronger, Rachel. We didn't think you'd make it into such a big deal. And maybe that's what gutted me the most, the fact that they didn't even try to deny it. They didn't even bother to lie. They just expected me to roll over, nod, and do what I'd always done, absorb the hit, swallow the insult, and quietly foot the bill. But this time, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let them see just how much I was unraveling inside. I just went home, sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and typed in the words, "Best financial fraud attorney near me." Because if they wanted to treat me like a bank, they were about to find out what happens when the bank calls in the debt. There's something almost surreal about sitting across a polished wooden desk from a lawyer you hired because your own parents committed fraud in your name and still somehow feeling like you're the one who did something wrong. The guilt sat heavy in my chest like a stone I didn't remember picking up, yet couldn't put down, and every time I opened my mouth to speak, it felt like I had to push past 1,000 years of learned silence just to form a sentence. I wasn't even sure what I expected when I walked into that office. Confirmation, maybe, that it had all been a misunderstanding, or some obscure loophole in the paperwork that would mean my parents hadn't really broken the law, just bent it a little. But what I got instead was brutal clarity, line by line, signature by signature, every page of that file screaming the truth I'd been trying to downplay for days. The lawyer's name was Dennis, sharp-eyed and calm-voiced, with the kind of demeanor that made you feel like no matter how ugly the situation got, he already had a strategy. He greeted me kindly, asked a few preliminary questions, then opened the folder I'd brought and started flipping through the documents I'd printed from the bank. His expression didn't change much at first, but the more he read, the more his brow tightened, and by the time he got to the third page, he leaned back in his chair and let out a breath that wasn't quite surprise, but definitely wasn't approval either. "This isn't just ethically wrong," he said, tapping one finger against the signature box. "This is textbook fraud. It's forgery, plain and simple." I swallowed hard, feeling the words hit me in the stomach like a punch, even though I already knew it. Seeing it confirmed by someone else, someone with a title and a legal degree and no emotional attachment to the people who raised me, it made it real in a way I hadn't prepared for. I stared at my own name printed neatly under forged initials, and for a moment I couldn't decide what felt worse, the betrayal itself, or the fact that I wasn't even shocked anymore. "They used my personal information," I said quietly, almost to myself. "They signed in my name, applied under my credit, and never told me. Not even a phone call." Dennis nodded, pushing the folder slightly closer to me. "That's not just a bad decision, Rachel. That's criminal. If they weren't your parents, you'd already be pressing charges. The damage to your credit alone could affect you for years. Job applications, mortgage approvals, interest rates, it all gets tangled up in this. And they didn't even ask. That's not family. That's exploitation." He wasn't wrong. But even as he spoke, I felt the old reflexes creeping up again, those deeply ingrained instincts that told me to minimize, to rationalize, to defend the people who hurt me because they were mine. I found myself saying things like, "I'm sure they didn't mean it like that," or "They probably thought they were helping Brandon," even though my stomach twisted with every excuse that left my mouth. It was like trying to explain away a broken bone by saying the fall wasn't that far. Sarah called me later that night, her voice sharp with fury I hadn't even expressed myself yet. I told her everything, every page, every signature, every clause that left me legally liable for thousands of dollars I never agreed to. She didn't hold back. "Press charges," she said flatly. "I don't care if it's your parents. If a stranger did this, you'd already be in court. They don't get to weaponize your love just because they share your last name." I didn't argue because she was right. But I didn't agree either, not yet. The guilt was still there, hanging on me like a weight I didn't know how to drop. I thought about birthdays and holidays, about the times my father taught me how to ride a bike or grilled burgers in the backyard, like everything he'd done could somehow counterbalance this. I thought about my mother's voice when she used to sing softly while folding laundry, like the sound of care could excuse her silence now. But no memory was loud enough to drown out what I saw on those pages. And somewhere in that growing silence inside me, something started to shift, not all at once, not like a thunderclap, but more like a slow, quiet unraveling of the version of love I'd been taught to accept. For the first time, I started asking a question that had never felt safe before. What if love without respect isn't love at all? Dennis called the next day, voice calm, steady, no pressure in his tone. "We can move forward in two ways," he said. "We can handle this quietly through negotiation and civil action, or we can go public and take legal steps that will make everything part of the official record. It's your call." And in that moment, sitting at my kitchen table with my phone pressed to my ear and the weight of every betrayal still buzzing in my bloodstream, I realized something I hadn't admitted until now. It wasn't about whether I loved them. It was about whether I could ever respect myself again if I didn't respond. There's a kind of power in staying quiet, not the silence that comes from fear or helplessness, but the deliberate kind, the kind you wear like armor when you know exactly what's coming and you're the only one in the room who's read the full script. After that call with Dennis, I didn't raise hell, didn't shout or slam doors or send a storm of text messages like some vengeful soap opera character looking to make a scene. Instead, I did what I had always been taught to do. I stayed calm, I stayed polite, and I played it exactly the way they would expect, right up until the moment they'd realize I wasn't playing their game anymore. I decided I'd give them exactly what they'd given me for years: the illusion of safety, the illusion of control, and the illusion of forgiveness, until it was too late to pull back. I sent the message to my parents on a Thursday morning, short and sweet, as if nothing heavy hung beneath the words, "Dinner at my place next weekend. Just us. I want to clear the air." The kind of message that sounded like a white flag, the kind of message they'd interpret as an invitation back into familiar roles. Me, the good daughter who eventually backs down, and them, the authoritative parents who believe a home-cooked meal and a few empty apologies will sweep betrayal neatly under a rug. I could already picture my mother reading it aloud in that syrupy voice she always used when she thought she'd won, already imagining her telling my father, "See? She's coming around." Sure enough, the reply came within hours. "We're glad you're thinking clearly now. I'll bring your favorite wine. I'll make a roast." I almost laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable, so perfectly on brand. Donna believed in the healing power of pot roast and red wine because it allowed her to bypass any accountability and dress her manipulation in warmth and nostalgia. And James, well, he believed in control through calm authority, the illusion of reason while bulldozing over boundaries. Neither of them realized that the entire dinner would be a stage, and I was the one holding the script this time. In the days leading up to it, I didn't tell anyone what I planned except Sarah, and even she didn't get the full details. She knew enough to recognize I wasn't backing down, but she also knew better than to question my silence. Still, she couldn't resist checking in constantly, sending messages that ranged from, "Don't chicken out, boss lady," to, "Are you sure you want to do this in your own house?" And my answer every time was the same: absolutely. Because there's something poetic about delivering consequences in the exact space where people once underestimated you. There's something perfect about turning the dinner table, the same one where you were once lectured, shamed, minimized, into a courtroom of your own design. Brandon called the night before, giddy and casual, probably thinking this was just a minor bump in the road now smoothed over. "Looking forward to dinner," he said. "I've got some business updates to share. Thinking about expanding into digital marketing. Big moves coming." I let him talk, let him ramble about funding and projections and vision boards, all while pretending I hadn't spent the last week reviewing every legal document tied to his loan and every financial decision my parents had quietly shoved under my name. I told him I was excited to hear all about it. I smiled while the rage burned quietly beneath the surface like coals waiting for the right moment. By the time Saturday arrived, the house was spotless, the wine was chilled, and the table was set like something out of a lifestyle magazine. I wore a soft beige blouse, nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just calm, controlled elegance, exactly the kind of image they would read as receptive and ready to reconcile. They came with smiles and a casserole dish, like everything could be mended with civility and a few servings of starch. Brandon was the first to speak once dinner began, launching into a speech about his new business pivot, using phrases like scaling strategically and redefining the market niche, as if the last failure had never happened. Donna nodded along proudly, and James asked a few surface-level questions to make it look like support, but we all knew what they really wanted, to steer the conversation away from anything uncomfortable, to erase the weight of what they'd done with polite conversation and a second helping of potatoes. I smiled through every minute, listening, nodding, pouring wine, watching their comfort build itself like a house of cards right in front of me. And then, just before dessert, my phone buzzed with a single message from Sarah. "Ready." I looked at the screen for a moment, then slowly typed out my reply, still smiling, still calm, still the daughter they thought they had wrapped neatly back under their thumbs. Let's make it hurt. There's a strange tension that builds in the quiet moments before a storm, not loud or dramatic, but low and slow, humming beneath the surface like a distant drumbeat that only you can hear. As I sat there at the table with my family, pretending to laugh at small talk and pushing food around my plate, I could feel that tension swelling in my chest with every passing second. The air felt thicker with each comment, each glance, each familiar rhythm of performance we'd all slipped into so easily, like actors in a play we'd been rehearsing for decades. Donna was the first to deliver her usual opening act, a soft sigh and a smile wrapped in passive aggression, her voice tinged with false concern as she looked at me across the table. "We're just so glad you found time to host," she said sweetly, dabbing at the corner of her mouth with a napkin she didn't need. "You've always got such a tight schedule. Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever see you again after this wedding." It was a comment I'd heard 100 times in different costumes, each one framed as a joke, a compliment, a maternal observation, but always meant to remind me that I was somehow too busy for family, too distant, too selfish for choosing my own life over their constant needs. I didn't react, just smiled politely, nodded, and poured her another glass of wine, knowing exactly how short her comfort window was about to be. Brandon, as usual, didn't notice a thing beneath the surface. He was too busy talking about his latest business plan, something about digital consulting, an online branding firm, a groundbreaking model he couldn't fully articulate but was apparently confident enough to pitch at the dinner table. He dropped buzzwords like breadcrumbs, hoping they'd lead to admiration, maybe even more money, never realizing the irony of bragging about entrepreneurial ambition at a table funded by someone else's stolen credit. James was quiet at first, listening with that smug paternal silence that always made him feel like the authority in any room, arms crossed, chin lifted slightly, the unspoken reminder that his opinion was final, even if no one asked for it. I could see him watching me out of the corner of his eye, waiting for me to chime in, to offer praise, to play my part as the supportive sister who never questioned how things got paid for. As if I hadn't already seen every line of the loan documents in black ink and legal language that made my blood run cold. And then, right as the second bottle of wine was opened and Brandon launched into another speech about projected revenue and potential investors, I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my glass. I didn't so much as clear my throat loudly. I just placed my hands gently on the table's edge, let the room fall silent for a moment, and said in a steady voice, "I'd like you all to meet someone." The front door opened a second later, and Dennis walked in suit-pressed, briefcase in hand, expression unreadable. The sound of his footsteps on the tile echoed louder than any shout I could have thrown, and the room froze like someone had cut the power. Donna's hand paused mid-reach toward her glass. Brandon stopped talking mid-sentence. James's eyebrows lifted just enough to betray his confusion, followed by suspicion, followed by the unmistakable flicker of fear. "This is Dennis," I said calmly, almost pleasantly. "My attorney." I motioned for him to sit, and he did slowly, deliberately, placing his briefcase on the table and opening it with the kind of precision that only makes sense when you know what you're about to reveal is going to permanently alter the dynamics of a room. He began pulling out the documents one by one, copies of the loan application, verification emails, forged signatures, bank communications, and a letter of intent detailing legal consequences if restitution wasn't made. Brandon went pale almost immediately, his bravado melting off him like wax under a flame, his mouth opening slightly as he stared at his own name tied to accounts he never thought anyone else would see. Donna's face shifted rapidly between confusion and horror, lips parting like she wanted to object, but couldn't find a single word that wouldn't confirm her guilt. And James stood up slowly, jaw clenched, face red, and voice rising in a tone I'd heard far too many times in my life. "What the hell is this supposed to be?" he barked, looking at me like I'd just betrayed the family code, like I was the one who crossed a line by refusing to be walked over one more time. Dennis didn't even flinch. He calmly slid a document toward him, withdrawal forms, outlining how my name would be removed from any financial obligation pending legal agreement and full repayment, or else civil charges would proceed without further warning. "You want to know what this is?" I said, voice steady but louder now, no longer pretending. "This is me cleaning up the mess you made in my name." "You're blowing this way out of proportion," James snapped, hand slamming against the table. "No," I said, standing taller, refusing to break eye contact. "I'm correcting the proportion you always thought I'd carry without complaint." Donna finally found her voice, whispering, "Rachel, please, we didn't mean for it to go this far," and that's when I looked at all of them, every face around that table. Every pair of eyes that had once looked at me like I was just the support beam holding everyone else's failures in place. "I'm not your backup plan anymore," I said. And for the first time in my life, the silence at that table didn't feel like surrender. It felt like victory. After the dinner ended in a blur of red-faced shouting, awkward silence, and chairs scraping against the hardwood floor as they left one by one, I didn't feel triumphant the way I thought I might. I didn't feel like I'd won some grand war or delivered a dramatic final blow that would echo in family legend. I felt something quieter, something heavier but steadier, like a weight shifting from my shoulders to the ground. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for their approval, their apology, or their inevitable attempt to reassert control. I wasn't holding my breath anymore. I was just still. And that stillness, that calm refusal to be pulled back into their orbit, was a kind of peace I didn't even know I'd been starving for. But of course, it wasn't over just because the documents hit the table. The next morning, my phone lit up with calls I had no intention of answering, first from James, then Donna, then Brandon, as if they'd each taken turns trying to reclaim whatever scraps of power they thought they still had left. I let them go to voicemail, and each message was exactly what I expected, a twisted mix of guilt, rage, denial, and thinly veiled threats delivered through clenched jaws and carefully chosen words. James's message was first, and it sounded more like a warning than a plea. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice low and cold. "You don't understand the position you're putting this family in. You think you're proving something, but all you're doing is burning bridges you can't rebuild." He didn't say sorry. He didn't admit fault. He didn't ask what he could do to fix it. He just wanted to remind me that, in his eyes, I was still a child misbehaving rather than an adult demanding accountability. Donna's message was softer, but no less manipulative, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere, her words dipped in nostalgia like that could somehow erase what she'd done. "I wish you hadn't involved outsiders," she said, as if bringing in a lawyer to fix a fraudulent loan was some kind of betrayal. "I just wanted to help your brother. I didn't think it would hurt you this much." As if the damage didn't count unless I bled in front of them. Brandon's message was the last to come through, and it was the most pathetic of all, a weak, stumbling apology buried beneath excuses about pressure, timing, and how he never really understood how serious it was. He didn't offer to fix anything. He didn't offer to repay the loan. He just wanted to be let off the hook without consequences, like always. But I didn't answer. I didn't call back. I didn't write a response or send a text or explain myself further. Because the truth is, when people finally realize they've lost control over you, they don't want reconciliation, they want restoration. They want the version of you that tolerated everything and asked for nothing. And I wasn't interested in being that version anymore. The next step was clean and quiet, just how I wanted it. I met with Dennis again and finalized every piece of paperwork needed to protect myself from ever being legally tied to their financial mess again. I withdrew from every co-signed agreement, removed myself from shared insurance, froze any account access they may have quietly retained, and filed a permanent restriction that blocked my identity from being used without direct authorization. Then, I updated my own will, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I removed their names from everything, replaced them with organizations that meant something to me, people who had actually shown up for me, not just claimed ownership over my existence like it was a debt to be collected. Sarah came over that night, bringing Thai food and cheap wine, and we sat on my porch under the soft glow of string lights, our feet propped up on the railing, the kind of casual silence between us that only years of friendship can create. I told her everything, every word they said, every document I signed, every step I'd taken to finally unbind myself from their reach. She listened without interrupting, occasionally refilling our glasses, occasionally shaking her head with that familiar mix of disbelief and fury. When I was done talking, she leaned back and said, "You know, I always thought you'd explode one day, kick down the door and go full scorched earth. But this was better. This was surgical." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true. It hadn't been about rage. It had been about precision. About refusing to carry their consequences just because I was capable of carrying anything. And the strangest part was, I didn't feel bitter. I didn't feel angry. I just felt done. I looked out across the quiet street, the sky fading from soft lavender to deep navy, and realized this was what peace looked like. Not a perfect life, not a flawless ending, but the absence of the weight I'd been conditioned to believe was mine to bear forever. Sometimes the cost of peace is everything they assumed they were entitled to. So tell me, what would you have done?